guys, it's Nicole. I'm back with another video, and today's video is actually going to be about a book I read very recently. I think I finished the book a week or two ago. I have been making videos of books that I've read in my past that I loved, that stuck with me, and I do intend to continue doing that as well, but I also want to talk about books that I've currently been reading and what I think of them. So the book I'm going to be talking about today, I picked up a couple of months ago. It took me a little bit of time to read because I actually only read about a chapter of this book a day. They're not very long chapters, so it doesn't take very long to read a chapter. And the only reason I did that was because it was not exactly a genre of book I typically read. And I would start to fall asleep or not necessarily get bored, but I was interested in reading it, but it wasn't like I'm gonna read a bunch of this all at the same time. Like, for some reason it worked better for me personally to just read one chapter a day. So it took me a little bit of time to read. So the book I'm talking about today is Little Women. This is just the version I picked up recently. I don't know if there's other cover versions, or I don't know for sure, but I picked this one up recently, sometime this past summer. And I had never read Little Women before. I know that there's been films made based on it, and I know that the book has been around forever. And I remember seeing it in the store and thinking, you know, I've been wanting to read some classics for a while now. I typically don't read classics, but there was something about Little Women that I'm like, I don't know, there's just something I want to read this now for some reason. So that was really why I picked it up. The cover really didn't have anything to do with it. I mean, the cover is pretty, it seems like a classical kind of like painting or drawing, you know. It's four girls on the cover, like all looking at each other clearly in the midst of a normal day-to-day conversation. So there wasn't anything particularly special to me about this cover. I didn't look at it and go, oh wow, this is amazing, but I think it's a good cover. And after having read the book, I think it suits the book very well. So I don't know any other versions of the cover, but I think that this works very well for it. If you're like me and hadn't read this book, I'm entering my late 20s now, so I had not read this book until now. In case you have no idea what this book is about, I am going to go ahead and read the back. So at the top in a bigger font, it says, Meg, Jo, Amy, and Beth, 4 little women, enduring hardships and enjoying adventures in Civil War New England. Now on to the actual blurb. The charming story of the March sisters, Little Women, has been adored for generations. Readers have rooted for Laurie in his pursuit of Jo's hand, cried over the family's tragedy, and dreamed of traveling through Europe with old Aunt March and Amy. Aspiring writers have found inspiration in Jo's devotion to her writing. In this simple, enthralling tale, Louisa May Alcott has created 4 of American literature's most beloved women. In her enlightening, thoughtful introduction, Ellen Showalter discusses Louisa May Alcott's influences and her aspirations for Little Women, as well as the impact the novel has had on such women writers such as Joyce Carol Oates and Cynthia Ozick. So yes, I did forget to mention the author of Little Women is Louisa May Alcott. And not only is the book set in Civil War New England, I believe it was also written during that time. Yeah, 1868 to 1869. So around the time it was written, so around the time of the Civil War in New England. So yes, there is an introduction in this book. I think there actually might be kind of like a couple of introductions, where this book has been around so long, and there are people that have a way of introducing the book, especially to new readers like myself, to kind of give a little bit of insight and maybe even explain some things, because this was written like over 100 years ago. And so the language, the social norms, just everything about this book is the opposite of modern. And I think what's great about the introductions is they kind of give, especially for people like me who have just read this book for the very first time, especially, and I'm glad I read it as an adult instead of a child, a little bit of insight into how this book can be viewed as a very early work of feminism, or it can be viewed as it wasn't feminism at all. And especially because of how things worked out with the publication of this book. Because this version of Little Women, especially the one that I read, the one that is popular today, that has been since it was, well, since the year after it was published, I want to say, was they essentially republished this book. So Little Women was first published in 1868, and it was published in the way that Louisa May Alcott wanted it to be. So she had an editor, but she wrote it a very specific way, and then they published it and released it that way. And it didn't do very well. But mostly because it didn't do very well because they only really released it in the New England area, and the publishers were pushing her to essentially change a lot of the book and how it was written and how characters talked to try to make it more relatable for the whole country, because they really wanted to release it, you know, countrywide, nationwide, and they wanted it to be more accepted and more relatable so that it would sell better. And she did give in to that. She allowed them to change things. And so technically the version that we read today of Little Women is actually not the original version. And I would be interested in reading the original version. I don't know if it exists anywhere. If anyone knows if it exists, let me know in the comments. But that's one of the reasons why, especially in this introduction, that there are arguments out there that this is not an example of feminism, and she even gave into it, so it's not feminism. And yet there's the argument that, well, she gave in so that it could be released farther and so that it could reach more people and that it would be read by more people. And yeah, there's a back and forth. And so there's two kind of arguments that you read, or that you can read, you can always skip over it, that you can read as in the introduction of this book. So I do like that you get that kind of perspective, the modern perspective of, is this feminism? Is this a version of feminism from Civil War era New England, North America? And I'm kind of torn between which side I fall on. I find both arguments interesting and honestly both valid. I find both sides of the argument valid. I see why there is an argument for both sides. And yet at the same time, I think I'm siding a little bit more with the side that this is feminism in a way, especially the way some of it is written, because there are some aspects of the book that are very traditional, old-fashioned as we would call it these days, but there are things written in this book that, to me, even with the modern eye, are very ahead of their time. Think about the era that this book was written in. Civil War America. Let's think about that, okay? America is not necessarily known for its open-mindedness. And especially back during the Civil War, open-mindedness and free thinking was not exactly a thing back then, especially if you wanted to be published and known and do your work out, you know, and not just have it written and kept in a safe because, you know, you couldn't get published, especially as a woman back then. So there are so many themes in this book that to me are very ahead of their time, which is feminism. Feminism is always trying to push the boundaries, always thinking, free thinking. And to me, there's a lot of those themes in this book. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of things that we would consider old-fashioned and traditional, but I do think personally that this could really be considered like feminism literature. I mean, again, it's all opinion. There's arguments and papers written on this that you could argue back and forth on either side, but I think I fall more on the side that this is more of a work of feminism than anything else. Just because, and I've heard this before from a history professor of mine back when I was in college, you can't judge, or you shouldn't judge, the past and people's behavior in the past from modern eyes. we tend to look back at things that happened in the past and have this sort of righteous attitude of, oh, well, this isn't what I would have done, so it's wrong, like it's incorrect. And it's like, you weren't there. You didn't exist during those times, and you don't understand fully. Like, we can understand on a certain level just as people, but we can't understand fully what it was like during those times, during any time other than the one you're currently living in. And so judging anything from the past with a modern view, with a modern mindset, is not really fair. And so I think that's why I'm more on the side of this is more of a work of feminist literature, especially because of how everything turns out for the author herself, Louisa May Alcott, and how everything turns out for all the characters. So to me, this is feminism from the 1860s in North America. I would love to hear anyone's thoughts in the comments if anyone disagrees with that. I think that there's a reason that there are classics in literature. I made a video about The Great Gatsby. That's another classic that I read recently, or maybe last year. And I think that there's a reason that they're classics. I think that they were amazing and ahead of their time when they were first published. And either we enjoy them today or we don't. I think The Great Gatsby was fine. I said in my video, and I still think this, I think it's slightly overrated. To me, Little Women is not overrated. I think for me, the reason this is such a classic and the reason it is so just well loved and has been made into many different film versions is because so many of the things that happen for the characters in this book can so easily happen today in the exact same circumstances. So Louisa May Alcott, although she was a white woman that lived in New England in the 1860s, there was something that she clearly understood just about human nature, regardless of your race, your age, where you come from, anything about yourself. There's just something about humanity that it felt like she understood, you know, the worries that people have, the fears that people, you know, experience just growing up. Because so Little Women is actually two parts. When it was first published, it was actually part 1 and part 2, and they were two separate novels. And I don't know when this happened, but eventually they were combined into the one novel you have today. So in the middle of the book at some point, it's essentially like it says part 2 on the top, because it kind of like ends, you know, because part 1 is as it mentions on the back, Meg, Jo, Amy, and Beth, they're all sisters, and it's about them. The part 1 is about them when they were young, when they were all under the age of 20, because they're all different ages. And then part 2 is when they're young adults, you know, and back then that was just adults because they were getting married, and, you know, in the 1860s that was normal. So that's why this book is a little bit thick, but the chapters are not very long. I am going to read page 1 of the book just to give everyone a little bit of a sample of what the book is like. And then I'm going to go into some spoilers. So if you don't want any spoilers because you've never read it, then you can stop there. But first, I'll read the first page of the book, just in case anyone wants to get a feel of what the book might sound like. Because like I said, this was written in the 1860s, and as much as people will disagree with me on this, it is harder to read English from different eras because they spoke differently. Words that mean something different today meant something wildly different back then. And you have to go and look those things up. So yes, it is a little bit harder to read. And I don't like it when people are snobby and say, oh, it's just read it. It's still English. It's like, no, it is a little bit harder to read because things meant different things. And even the way they spoke is just not how we speak today. So this is part 1, chapter 1. The chapter is called Playing Pilgrims. Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents, grumbled Jo, lying on the rug. It's so dreadful to be poor, sighed Meg, looking down at her old dress. I don't think it's fair for some girls to have lots of pretty things and other girls nothing at all, added little Amy with an injured sniff. We've got father and mother and each other anyhow, said Beth, contentedly from her corner. The four young faces on which the firelight shone brightened at the cheerful words, but darkened again as Jo said sadly, "We haven't got father, and shall not have him for a long time." She didn't say perhaps never, but each silently added it, thinking of father far away where the fighting was. Nobody spoke for a minute, then Meg said in an alerted tone, "You know the reason Mother proposed not having any presents this Christmas was because it's going to be a hard winter for everyone, and she thinks we ought not to spend money for pleasure when our men are suffering so in the army. We can't do much, but we can make our little sacrifices, and ought to do it gladly." But I am afraid I don't, and Meg shook her head as she thought regretfully of all the things she wanted. That's kind of what it sounds like. It's like I said, it's not super crazy. There are more instances when you get further into the book that might be a little bit different than the English we know today. So they do have little notes, like little numbers next to some of the sentences that have something that you may not understand. And then there's a notes section really, in the back of the book that you can refer to kind of understand a little bit more. And of course you have your friend Google, which I did for words that I'd never heard of before because we just don't use them anymore. So I love the first chapter and I love the first page because, well, first of all, the first chapter really introduces them, especially as when they were little girls. But the first page is really great because there's an introduction for each of the sisters. They each have a sentence that they say out loud, and it's so sweet because they obviously sound so young. We won't have any presents and Christmas won't be Christmas, and it sounds so childish and young, and it's such a huge contrast to the second part of the book when they are more like adults. I want to say because Amy is the youngest, I want to say she's entering her 20s. She might be in her late teens, I want to say. So it goes in the order. Meg is the oldest, then there's Jo, and then there's Beth, and then there's Amy. In the first part of the book, Meg is about 16, Jo is about 15, Beth is around 13 or 14, and Amy is about 12 or 13. So they're all pretty young in the first part of the book, and then it's like, I want to say 3 to 5 years later in part 2. So you get to see their lives. It's literally, this whole book is just, we are the viewers of watching them grow up and learn certain life lessons that I think everybody eventually learns. But they do it in their own way, and you learn how, you get to watch how they learn those lessons. And my favorite character of this book is their mom. And the reason why is because, and there's so much I just want to know. She is a very, very, very compassionate, considerate mother. And one of the instances, Jo gets into something where she does something she regrets, and her mother is just very compassionate and even tells her, I did something similar, and yes, like, you shouldn't do those things, but you need to give yourself grace, essentially, and you're allowed to have those feelings. You need to learn eventually to not let those feelings control you. And I just love that so much because I feel like if any time I've read or even watched any kind of art or literature from a different era, a lot of the time it seemed like parents were just very strict and you get to do this, I don't care what your feelings are, this. But the entire book is about their mother validating their feelings and then giving them advice that she says they don't have to take into what they can do to better themselves if they want to, because they don't have to, but they should. And I loved that. I thought that was also very ahead of its time for me. And I can't help but wonder, was Louisa May Alcott's mother like that? Or was she writing a version of a mother that she wished she had? I don't know. It's all just very cool to me. I am going to talk a little bit about spoilers, not very long though, because I don't want to make this video too crazy long. So if you don't want any spoilers, go ahead and turn the video off. And if you are leaving, thank you so much for watching. But I am going to get into a little bit of spoilers right now. I want to talk a little bit about the scene, because this is one of my favorite parts of the book, that Jo does something that she regrets and that her mother and her had that conversation. So essentially, in part 1 of the book, Jo and Meg, they're the older ones, they're teenagers, are going to go out and have fun with Laurie, who is their next door neighbor, and he is a boy. His name is actually Theodore, but he does not like his first name, and his last name is Lawrence, so he goes by Laurie. They go out to go see some entertainment, and Amy begs to go with them, but she's 12. Like, I may not have any siblings, but I do understand the dynamic of when you yourself are a 15 to 16-year-old girl and you don't want a 12-year-old having to be around you and you have to keep an eye on them. You want to go have fun. You want to go hang out with people your own age, not necessarily your 12-year-old little sister. And so Jo and Meg were like, no, you can't come with us. And Jo was a little bit mean about it, but that's because Amy was very adamant that she wanted to go with them and would not let it go. And Amy got really mad at Jo and took Jo's most prized possession, her notebook with her writing in it, because Jo loves to write. And Amy threw her book in the fire and it burned and it was gone. And yes, that was horrible, obviously. And I think she regretted it like pretty soon after she did it, but she can't take it back. And when Jo came home and was so upset about it, she did not want to forgive Amy. And the next day or two, when Jo went down to go ice skating on the frozen lake with Laurie, Amy really wanted to tag along, and Jo had promised her she would take her before it was spring. So Amy, secretly at Beth's encouragement, because they're all young and making mistakes, followed Jo and Laurie down to the pond without them knowing and started skating with them and hoped that they wouldn't send her home, like, after they discovered she was there. Unfortunately, she was too far back to hear this, but Laurie had skated ahead and said, hey, Jo, the ice in the middle of the pond is thinning. Don't go skating over there because you will fall through the ice. She heard that, and then as soon as she heard that, she turned and saw that Amy had come and followed them and now was skating to them from behind her. And she knew she should say something, but she didn't. And she was very angry at Amy, and Amy did end up skating towards the middle of the pond and falling through the ice. Amy ended up okay. Laurie rescued her. They took her home and they got her warmed up. But while Amy was resting in bed asleep, Jo confessed to her mother that she actually knew that Amy was going to fall in the ice and actually kind of let her because of how angry she was at her. And Jo really, really regretted it because, man, if things had been so different, if they hadn't gotten Amy out of the ice in time, I mean, she might have died. And so she regretted it so much. And she says, I do these things out of anger, and sometimes I just can't help myself, and I don't know what to do about it. And that's why I loved their mother so much, because she went and she consoled Jo, and she said, look, I had the same kind of temper when I was your age. I would say things, I would fly off the handle, and all it would do was hurt other people or hurt myself. And it's understandable because I did that stuff too. And I loved so much that she was actually so vulnerable with Jo. You know, she was like, I did that too. She wasn't trying to be this perfect statuesque version of a mom. She was like, yeah, I did that too. And guess what? It's okay. It ended up being okay. So all you can do is, and for them, they're very religious. And so for them, the way that they cope is, you know, pray, you know, talk to him and use him as your strength, you know, envision him and use him as your strength. I'm not very religious, and you don't have to use religion, but I loved that her mom validated her feelings and then gave her something to try in order to modify her behavior instead of her feelings. And to me, that was honestly one of my favorite parts of the book, because it just felt so ahead of its time. Like I said, to me, that is so part of feminism, because that is femininity. Acknowledging feelings and actually allowing yourself to feel them, and then moving forward about modifying behavior. And it's something that is rooted in strength, and yet even up until recently, it's seen as a weakness to validate feelings. So that's why it's just so ahead of its time. So I wanted to give my thoughts, especially on that particular scene, that particular chapter, because that's what really stuck out to me from this book. So those are my thoughts on Little Women. I do intend to go watch some of the films. I have never seen any of the films of Little Women, so reading the book was my first experience with it, and I'm glad it was. So I don't know. We'll see which version I start with first. I know that there's definitely a couple. The most recent one I'm very excited to watch because I love all the actresses in it. But that is all for this week's video. I want to thank you so much if you've watched all the way through, especially if you've subscribed to my channel recently, because it means so much to me. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please subscribe. It costs nothing. It would mean so much. So please subscribe. You will get notified every time I upload a new video, which I typically do Tuesdays and Friday mornings. But if I decide to make new content and start uploading on different days, you'll get notified when I do that as well. So please like, comment, share this video with anyone you think might enjoy it. And yeah, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.